December 1939, a Soviet T-26 tank advances through the frozen forests of Finland during the Winter War. The crew is confident. They are armored. The Finns are not. They have firepower. The Finns have only small arms. Then something arcs through the air and shatters against the tank's engine deck. Flames erupt instantly, spreading across the rear of the vehicle. Within seconds, the engine compartment is engulfed. The crew bails out into the snow, choking on smoke and burning fuel. The Finns who threw the improvised firebomb vanish back into the forest. They have just demonstrated that a simple bottle filled with flammable liquid can stop a tank. The Finns, with dark humor characteristic of their resistance, name the weapon after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, who had claimed Soviet bombers were dropping food, not bombs, on Finnish cities. If Molotov was delivering bread from above, the Finns said, then they would deliver him cocktails from below. The Molotov cocktail was born as an act of defiance and mockery. 2 years later, when German Panzers rolled across the Soviet border in Operation Barbarossa, Soviet soldiers would use the same weapon, still bearing the same name, to defend their cities. The irony was not lost on anyone. The problem facing Soviet forces in summer 1941 was existential. The Wehrmacht's armored spearheads were advancing faster than Soviet forces could react. Mechanized units were being bypassed and encircled. Infantry divisions found themselves facing tanks with inadequate anti-tank weapons. The standard anti-tank rifle, the PTRD and PTRS models, could penetrate light armor but were ineffective against German medium and heavy tanks. Anti-tank guns were being overrun or destroyed faster than they could be positioned. Artillery was too slow to respond to rapidly moving armor. Soviet tank units were being destroyed in detail by superior German tactics and coordination. What Soviet infantry needed was a weapon that could be produced immediately in enormous quantities, required no special training, used no scarce materials, and could disable or destroy tanks at close range. The answer was the weapon that had been used against them just 2 years earlier, the Molotov cocktail. The Soviet leadership, putting practicality above pride, ordered mass production of incendiary bottles. The name Molotov cocktail was officially adopted, turning the Finnish mockery into a badge of desperate resistance. The basic concept was simple: fill a glass bottle with flammable liquid, add an ignition source, throw it at a tank, and let physics do the rest. Tanks, despite their armor, are vulnerable to fire. Engine compartments contain fuel lines, oil, and flammable materials. Vision ports and hatches have seals that can be damaged by intense heat. Crew members inside an enclosed metal box surrounded by burning fuel will abandon the vehicle rather than roast alive. The psychological effect of fire is profound. Soldiers can endure bullets and shells with some degree of emotional detachment, but fire is primal terror. Tank crews who survived Molotov cocktail attacks often refused to enter their vehicles again. The weapon was not elegant or sophisticated, but under the desperate conditions of 1941, it was available and it worked. Soviet military leadership issued orders in July 1941 directing the production and distribution of Molotov cocktails to frontline units. Factories were designated to produce the bottles. Chemical formulae were standardized. Training manuals were distributed. The improvised weapon of the Finnish resistance became official Soviet military equipment. The initial production was crude. Soldiers filled empty vodka bottles with whatever flammable liquid was available: gasoline, kerosene, or alcohol. A rag soaked in fuel was stuffed into the neck as a wick. The soldier would light the wick and throw the bottle. This method was effective but dangerous. The lit wick could cause premature ignition if the thrower was hit or stumbled. Rain made ignition difficult. High winds could extinguish the wick mid-flight. The Soviets quickly moved to improve the design. The Alko factory, which had ironically produced vodka, was repurposed to manufacture military specification Molotov cocktails. The improved design used a chemical ignition system that activated on impact, eliminating the need for external flame. The mixture typically consisted of gasoline or kerosene, thickened with additives to make it sticky and harder to extinguish. Some variants included white phosphorus, which would ignite spontaneously on contact with air when the bottle broke. The chemical mixture would cling to the tank's surface and burn at temperatures high enough to damage armor seals, ignite fuel, and create toxic smoke that would infiltrate the crew compartment. The industrialization of the Molotov cocktail was a remarkable achievement in rapid military production. The Alko factory in Finland, captured by the Soviets during the Winter War, became the primary production facility. This was darkly appropriate, using a Finnish factory to mass-produce the weapon the Finns had invented to fight Soviet tanks. By late 1941, the factory was producing over 450,000 bottles per month. Production eventually reached several million units over the course of the war. The bottles themselves were specifically designed for the purpose. Standard glass bottles were reinforced slightly to survive handling, but thin enough to shatter reliably on impact. Each bottle held approximately half a liter of incendiary mixture. The mixture formulation was critical. Pure gasoline would splash on impact and burn quickly, but without lasting effect. The Soviet chemical corps developed thickening agents, often based on rubber dissolved in solvent, that would make the fuel sticky and clingy. This napalm-like mixture would adhere to vertical surfaces and continue burning even when the tank tried to drive away. The burning mixture would flow into gaps and openings, finding its way into engine compartments and crew spaces. The ignition system evolved through several iterations. Early chemical igniters used sulfuric acid in a small ampule attached to the bottle. On impact, the acid would mix with potassium chlorate and sugar packed around the ampule, causing immediate ignition. This system was relatively reliable but required careful handling during transport. Later variants used white phosphorus, which ignites spontaneously on contact with air. A small amount of white phosphorus would be placed in the bottle along with the fuel mixture. When the bottle broke, exposing the phosphorus to air, ignition was instant and reliable. The phosphorus also added a psychological element. White phosphorus burns at extremely high temperatures and produces dense white smoke. Soldiers hit by phosphorus would continue burning until the phosphorus was completely consumed or denied oxygen. Tank crews understood that a phosphorus-based Molotov cocktail meant certain death if the fire entered the crew compartment. Training programs were established to teach proper use of Molotov cocktails. Soldiers learned to identify vulnerable points on tanks. The engine deck was the primary target, where flames could reach fuel lines and ignite engine oil. The rear of the turret, where ammunition was often stored, was another prime target. Vision ports and hatches were secondary targets, where flames could obscure vision and force crews to button up, reducing their situational awareness. Soldiers were taught to throw from positions where they could approach unseen, using rubble, buildings, or terrain for concealment. The effective range was approximately 20 to 30 meters. Closer was better, but getting too close meant being killed by machine gun fire from supporting infantry or from the tank's own weapons. The throwing technique was specific. A high arcing throw would allow the bottle to fall onto the top surfaces of the tank, where armor was thinnest and vulnerable points most numerous. A direct throw at the side might hit armor thick enough to prevent penetration of burning fuel into vital systems. Tactical doctrine emphasized using Molotov cocktails in groups. A single bottle might disable a tank or force the crew to abandon it, but multiple bottles thrown simultaneously gave much higher probability of catastrophic effect. Squads of 3 to 5 soldiers would coordinate their attacks, approaching from different angles and throwing in sequence to maintain pressure on the target. The first bottle might force the crew to button up. The second might ignite external fuel tanks or supplies strapped to the tank. The third might find its way into the engine compartment and cause terminal damage. The psychological effect on German tank crews was substantial. Tanks advancing into Soviet-held urban areas knew that every ruined building could conceal soldiers with bottles of fire. The Wehrmacht began modifying tactics, keeping tanks out of dense urban terrain where possible and increasing support infantry to clear buildings before armor advanced. These tactical adjustments slowed German advances and gave Soviet forces time to establish defensive lines. The combat effectiveness of Molotov cocktails during Operation Barbarossa exceeded expectations. In the desperate fighting around Leningrad, Soviet soldiers used Molotov cocktails to defend street by street. German Panzers advancing through rubble-filled streets found themselves under attack from all directions. A documented account from August 1941 describes a German armored column halted by concentrated Molotov cocktail attacks in the Leningrad suburbs. 7 tanks were disabled or destroyed in less than 20 minutes. The column withdrew, allowing Soviet forces to strengthen defensive positions. Similar accounts emerged from the defense of Moscow in October and November 1941. Soviet militia units, often composed of factory workers with minimal military training, used Molotov cocktails to ambush German tanks approaching from the west. The psychological impact on Wehrmacht morale was significant. German soldiers had been told they were fighting an inferior enemy. Being stopped by improvised weapons thrown by desperate civilians contradicted that narrative. The Battle of Stalingrad saw extensive use of Molotov cocktails in brutal close-quarters combat. The ruined city provided ideal conditions for ambush tactics. Soviet soldiers would allow German tanks to pass, then attack from the rear where armor was weakest. Ruined buildings provided concealment for approach and escape routes after the attack. German tanks operating in Stalingrad learned to never advance alone and to constantly watch for infantry threats. The casualty rate among Soviet soldiers using Molotov cocktails was extremely high. Getting within throwing range of a tank meant exposing oneself to machine gun fire from the tank, supporting infantry, and sometimes other tanks providing overwatch. Many soldiers died before they could throw their bottles. Others were killed by tank machine guns immediately after throwing. The weapon required courage bordering on suicidal. Orders to attack tanks with Molotov cocktails were essentially death sentences that soldiers accepted out of necessity and desperation. Despite the casualties, the weapon remained effective throughout the war. Even after Soviet industry recovered and began producing dedicated anti-tank weapons, like the PTRD anti-tank rifle, RPG-43 anti-tank grenade, and eventually shoulder-fired anti-tank rockets, the Molotov cocktail remained in use. It was cheap, required no special materials, could be produced anywhere, and was effective in the urban combat that characterized much of the Eastern Front. German tank crews developed countermeasures. Tanks began carrying more external stowage to shield engine decks. Crews would wrap spare tracks and equipment around vulnerable areas. Some tanks mounted additional armor screening around engine compartments. These measures reduced but did not eliminate Molotov cocktail effectiveness. A well-placed bottle could still find gaps in the improvised armor and cause catastrophic damage. The psychological effect never diminished. No amount of armor could protect against the primal fear of being burned alive. Statistical analysis of destroyed German tanks on the Eastern Front suggests that Molotov cocktails accounted for a small but significant percentage of total tank losses. Exact numbers are impossible to determine because many tanks disabled by Molotov cocktails were subsequently destroyed by other weapons or abandoned during retreats. What is clear is that the weapon forced tactical changes in German armor operations, slowed advances through urban terrain, and provided Soviet infantry with the means of fighting back against overwhelming armored superiority. If you are finding value in understanding how desperate measures became effective weapons, sharing this story helps more than you know. The Molotov cocktail represented the ultimate weapon of desperation, effective not because of sophisticated engineering, but because of the courage of soldiers willing to charge tanks with bottles of fire. The complete ironic circle of the Molotov cocktail is almost too perfect for fiction. Invented by Finns to fight Soviet tanks, named in mockery of a Soviet politician, then adopted by the Soviets and produced by the millions to fight German tanks, all while keeping the name that commemorated Soviet aggression against Finland. The weapon that began as improvised resistance became official military equipment, complete with production facilities, quality control standards, and training manuals. The dark humor of naming a weapon after Molotov while using it to defend the Soviet Union was not lost on Soviet soldiers, many of whom appreciated the irony. Stalin himself reportedly approved keeping the name, either not understanding the mockery or deciding that effectiveness mattered more than pride. Production numbers for Soviet Molotov cocktails are difficult to verify precisely because production was decentralized. The Alko factory produced over 450,000 per month at peak, suggesting total production in the millions. Smaller facilities across the Soviet Union also produced incendiary bottles using local materials and labor. Total wartime production may have exceeded 10 million units, making it one of the most widely produced weapons of the war. Comparing the Molotov cocktail to other improvised anti-tank weapons highlights its unique characteristics. The Germans used magnetic anti-tank mines that had to be placed directly on tank hulls, requiring even closer approach than Molotov cocktails. The British developed sticky bombs, glass spheres coated with adhesive and filled with nitroglycerin, but these were unreliable and dangerous to the user. The Japanese used lunge mines, explosives on poles that required a suicidal charge to use. The Molotov cocktail was less immediately lethal to the user than these alternatives while maintaining comparable effectiveness against tanks. The weapon's effectiveness derived from exploiting specific tank vulnerabilities. Early war tanks had external fuel tanks that could be ignited. Engine decks had cooling vents that allowed flames to reach internal components. Vision ports and hatches had rubber seals that would melt under intense heat. Ammunition stored in turret sides or rear could cook off if temperatures rose high enough. These vulnerabilities existed in all tanks, regardless of armor thickness, making the Molotov cocktail effective against light and heavy tanks alike. The post-war legacy of the Molotov cocktail extends well beyond World War II. The weapon has appeared in virtually every asymmetric conflict since, from the Hungarian uprising of 1956 to modern urban warfare. The fundamental design remains unchanged because the physics and psychology remain unchanged. Fire is terrifying, flammable liquids are available everywhere, glass bottles are common, and desperate people will use whatever weapons they can make. The weapon has become a symbol of resistance and desperation, associated with insurgencies, riots, and revolutions across the world. The name Molotov cocktail has entered common language, used by journalists, historians, and the general public to describe improvised incendiary devices, regardless of their actual composition or origin. Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister whose name became attached to the weapon through Finnish mockery, lived until 1986. He reportedly expressed ambivalence about his association with the improvised firebomb, understanding the irony but also recognizing that the weapon had contributed to Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. Whether he appreciated the dark humor of Soviets throwing Molotov cocktails at German tanks while shouting his name is not recorded. The technical simplicity of the Molotov cocktail conceals its profound impact on military history. It proved that weapons do not need to be sophisticated to be effective, that industrial capacity matters more than individual weapon quality, and that desperate defenders with improvised weapons can slow or stop mechanized invasions. The Soviets produced millions of bottles of fire and turned them into a standard military weapon. They trained soldiers in proper throwing techniques and target selection. They incorporated Molotov cocktails into tactical doctrine and defensive planning. What began as mockery became a weapon that helped save Moscow and Leningrad. In the vast catalog of World War II weapons, the Molotov cocktail stands out not for its sophistication, but for its universality and its darkly ironic origin. Born from Finnish resistance, named in mockery of Soviet propaganda, industrialized by Soviet factories and used to burn German tanks, the weapon completed a circle of historical irony that seems almost too perfect. The bottle bomb that stopped Panzers in 1941 remains a symbol of desperate resistance, proving that sometimes the most effective weapons are not the most advanced, but simply the ones that work when nothing else is available. The Soviets needed a way to fight tanks with materials at hand, and they found it in a bottle of fire bearing the name of their own foreign minister. History has recorded few weapons with such perfect ironic symmetry.